So, first of all, when I woke up and read this post on Basecamp, Becky's post, I was in bed and I was looking at my phone and I read it, and as I was reading, I was like, yeah, I was getting so excited that I jumped out of bed. I was like, okay, I got a lot of work to do. I got a lot of things that I need to do to respond. And I think the thing that's really exciting to me about this post is that it wasn't. I mean, I know you said that it's feedback, but it wasn't just feedback. It was you giving insight, you allowing me to look into your thinking and your mind, and that gives me insight about how you're thinking, what you're taking away from this, what questions you have, and where you want to go. So it was just very exciting to me. Um, so, okay, first of all, let's kind of start here in the beginning. In the beginning, here, you're talking to me about kind of what you've taken away from everything that I've posted thus far. My comments and the videos and the articles that I shared, and you've highlighted authenticity and respect. And absolutely, those are two major themes and topics that I have talked about. I've talked about, first of all, let me say this: the fact that this is what you're taking away from this means that it had relevance to questions and ideas that you were already kind of thinking about. Maybe not like overtly, maybe it wasn't at the forefront of your mind, but when I mentioned authentic materials and authentic learning, that those were things that connected with ideas or questions that you had already thought about. Now, I want to mention a couple more things just because I want you to perhaps go a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper with what you're already thinking about. And sorry, this was loaded before and now it was closed for some reason. Um, Probably untitled. Yep. Okay. All right. So you mentioned here that kind of you're looking at authentic materials and authentic learning and asking why and who behind the learning, and really I think it's great that these are the questions that you're asking, but it's more to kind of broaden it a little bit. It's also about just being very, very thoughtful and intentional about all your decisions, not just when it comes to providing a learning experience. Everything, how you communicate, the words that you use, the choices that you make. A lot of this just has to do with bringing intention into our work, um, taking care of the small details. Um, I think that's really hard to do as an early childhood teacher because in early childhood, it's an extremely multidisciplinary field. At any given time, we are expected to be knowledgeable about child development and psychology, about design and aesthetics and architecture, and about neuroscience and the brain and how children develop, and family relationships and communication building, and working together amongst your other colleagues with other teachers. It's an incredibly multidisciplinary field, and the the point that I'm trying to make is that we want to bring intention and thoughtfulness to all of these areas of our work. Um, so the other thing that I kind of just wanted to mention here, that when we're talking about Reggio, right? When we're talking about Reggio, there are a couple things that I want to point out that I think are embedded in what you mentioned, right? They're embedded, but they weren't called out specifically. And first of all, it has to do with constructivism, which is that weird word that I always keep bringing up. What we're essentially doing is creating a constructivist style of education. I know people understand that and have heard that from me, as opposed to a traditional behaviorist style of teaching, right? What I have found, or this is not scientifically researched or anything like that, but what I've noticed is that when people are engaging in that traditional behaviorist style teaching, they do it without knowing that they're doing behaviorist style teaching. They don't even know the difference between those two styles. But once you learn about constructivism, or once you start hearing about it or studying it, you definitely know what behaviorism is, and you definitely know what constructivism is, because you have to understand behaviorism to understand how, like, you have to understand behaviorism in order to kind of see what constructivism isn't. Does that make sense? Right? So, constructivist teachers tend to be a lot more thoughtful and intentional about the small decisions about where things are placed and where things go and what words am I using and how am I presenting this to the children, right? And that thoughtfulness and attention to detail is everything. That's everything. Now, the other thing that I want to mention when it comes to constructivism, right, is that we have to change our understanding of what learning is, right? What learning is. And again, this is something that you could study for years and not like fully kind of wrap your head around it. But the basic premise of what constructivism tells us as teachers, like what it means for us as teachers, is that children are active participants in their learning. They're active participants as opposed to passively receiving knowledge, right? So, passively receiving, what I mean by that is that all the decisions about what children should learn, the information that they need to know, the activities that are presented to them, all of that, it happens outside of them, of the teachers or administrators or policymakers or curriculum designers. They all design those things and say, here, spread it everywhere, give it to everyone, right? And there are many reasons why that doesn't work very well. And in constructivism, what we're saying is children are active participants in their learning. And because they are active participants in their learning, what it requires us to do as teachers is truly understand the children. Come from a place of what are the children thinking about? What are the questions they're asking? What are they curious about? Because we know as constructivist teachers that children are born with an inherent sense to be curious and to wonder, which means that all we're trying to do is nurture that and preserve it, right? Preserve their sense of curiosity, which is a nice segue here. Um, Children have this inherent sense to try and make meaning of the world. That's something that the CNN, where is it? The CNN news story that I shared. This one right here. This CNN news story. He mentions that children are just trying to make sense of the world. Right? They're constantly. Adults are always constantly trying to do that, and all we have to do is preserve that and give them some good processes around how to do that, right? So if they are inherently curious and wondering, right, what we're trying to do is foster that, but also turn that curiosity and that wonder into something really useful. Now, we have to think then, how do we make that useful, right? And that comes from having good ways to solve problems, teaching good processes for solving problems, as opposed to teaching content and information. I mean, we're living in a day and age now where I can literally type in here how thermodynamics works, right? And I can find out how this works, right? I can learn about thermodynamics. Information is literally at our fingertips, right? So teaching content and information just doesn't matter as much as it used to, right? There's a certain amount of content that that is just helpful for us to kind of have on hand, like within ourselves. But really, what matters is applying that, right? And so if there's a big takeaway that I kind of want people to have, it's this, what I'm talking about here in these 3 slides, is that children are active participants. They're not passive recipients of the information or content that we have as adults. They have this natural sense to wonder and curious, right? And to be curious. So all we're trying to do then is give them better processes around their curiosity, around their sense of wonder. So that's what teaching would look like. So when you think about infants and toddlers, right, and they're naturally curious and exploring and touching things and looking around, right? Give them interesting things to touch and look at and to play with, right? Give them interesting things to put things together and to have them get into the habit of, oh, I didn't think to put these two things together, right? You're teaching them to ask good questions, right? If for preschoolers, it's about this process of kind of working together and working in small groups and going through this process of creation, right? Of creativity, right? So that's those are some kind of other big takeaways that I just kind of wanted to add to what you're already talking about here, right? So you are not far off base on anything that you've mentioned. It seems like the your comments and your questions that you're asking are exactly what I would expect, right? And they are good questions. And that these are the kinds of questions that I find myself talking about and with when I go to these Reggio conferences and talk to these other Reggio teachers. You're on that path now, right? And I've heard these kinds of questions from other teachers now. We are now, as a staff, on this path. And that's something I definitely want to stress because it comes down to, your kind of totally at the end about like where things were getting frustrating and hard, right? Um, it should feel frustrating. It should feel hard. Like that means we are growing. That means you are developing. That means we are that uncomfortable feeling, that disequilibrium is something that multiple scholars and researchers have talked about that's where we need to be if we are in a state of growth, right? If we are learning. That's where children are constantly, right? That's where they are constantly. The need, the desire to get out of that disequilibrium is by trying to understand, by trying to um, make meaning of what is confusing or difficult or hard, right? And so all of that, all of those feelings that we have of feeling frustrated or this is hard or this is difficult or different, that's where we should be, right? So I've mentioned this person before. Her name's Judy Graves. She's working in the Gladstone School District. She has a project called Teaching Preschool Partners. And what she's doing is she's bringing Reggio inspired principles, and not just Reggio, it's more about constructivism than it is about Reggio, and bringing them into Head Start classrooms. Now, if you know anything about Head Start classrooms, if any of you have worked in or have worked with them, right, Head Start tends to have their own framework. They use TS Gold as well. They have all these developmental milestones and all these things that kind of stand at odds with project-based learning and constructivist style teaching. But they're doing it, right? They're doing it. Now, so what I'm trying to say here is that, and Judy Graves is also responsible for Opal School, which is where you've seen all of those amazing provocations, and their classroom spaces are just incredible, right? They just do incredible work, right? She's responsible for kind of the development of this school and the Children's Museum. Now, Judy Graves always talks about when she's working with new teachers, because she's done this for decades, right? When she's working with new teachers, she says that it takes about 5 years for teachers to have that feeling of what's that? Of like confidence, of that they kind of have an awareness and confidence is the right word, right? Confidence about what it is that they're doing. Now, 5 years may seem like it's a long time, and what the heck are you doing in those 5 years, right? Those 5 years that she talks about, which is just kind of her general guideline, those 5 years that she's talking about, there's an immense kind of like amount of research that you're doing on your behalf. You're reading and looking at videos and looking at other classrooms and attending professional development and conferences and things like that. And you're asking yourself these questions, and that gets you to a point where kind of every time you find or look for inspiration, you come to some new understanding about how to use materials, or you come to some new understanding about, oh, this is the way documentation works, or you come to some new understanding of, oh my gosh, this would be amazing for my families, right? And it's going to happen bit by bit. But here's the thing. Here's the real message in all of this. There's no such thing as a teacher who overnight is just kicking ass at being a good teacher. I've never seen it. It doesn't happen. That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in any field. There's nobody who just overnight they become that successful. Because for those people who tell me that someone just overnight they became a sensation, I will also talk to you and show you the years and hours of work that went into the one thing that they did that turned them into an overnight sensation. There was hours and years of work that went into that, and that just it was just they struck an opportunity that got them to make other people feel that they were an overnight success, right? One day I will have a viral YouTube video about something having to do with early childhood education. I know it. I know it. And I'm not going to say it's because I know how to make viral YouTube videos. It's the reason why I know it is because I'm spending all of this time and energy and learning about professional development, about creating these videos, about creating good content, so that when one day I make that one video, it'll explode, right? I have that confidence because I'm putting in the work, right? I'm putting in the work right now. So that's what we're doing. We're putting in this work. Okay. So when it comes to provocation, so your question here, watching how the children interact. Okay. So here's what I wanted to say about your what you've written here about materials and provocations. First of all, these these insights that you're sharing about the way you're using materials here, using authentic materials, using items from the real world, those are the things that usually people, when they're first starting to study the Reggio approach, those are the first kind of superficial or surface things that people start to do. And they play with that, and then they come to like new meanings and understandings. And it seems like for you, it's not superficial and on the surface, that you have some new awareness about how these items and materials are being used, right? So, yes, absolutely, right here. It encourages divergent thinking. They have to be innovators. I would add to that, children are inventors, authors, makers, creators, right? Artists, that they are all of these things. It's not something that happens in the future. Right now, treat them that way, and they will create and make and do. When you see these, let me just close that. So when you see these videos, right, about what the children are making, and you see their just amazing products, right? I personally have never worked on projects with young children where in Reggio they consistently make these amazing projects with the children, right? When you see that, right, like it's because that what they have this sense of children are inventors, makers, creators, authors, right? And that comes from something I've mentioned to you all before, having a strong image of children, right? You have to believe that. I can't teach it to you. It's not a skill. You have to believe that, right? So, yes. So, okay. I wanted to make a comment about this right here. Symbolic thinking in a way. So they have to take an item and turn it into something else. Symbolic thinking in a way, right? So I would argue, personally, that all of this, right, not just materials, right? Anything that, even stuff that children write or draw or make with painting or even verbal language, all has to do with symbolic thinking, right? When we're talking about symbolic thinking, we're also talking about abstract thinking, something that exists within the mind, right? And it is held within the mind without a physical object to kind of help your thinking, right? And everything that we're doing has to do with getting children and developing their sense of symbolic thinking and abstract thinking. And you know what? There might be some other teacher or researcher or academic person or another colleague or a parent who would argue against that, who argued against what I said. Now, where I'd love to see Discovery Zone head, what I think that what we are on the path towards doing is having those kinds of conversations between ourselves as a staff. Why is this important? Why is it important to have open-ended conversations about theory with each other? Because that's where we get to innovation. That's where we get to inventing new ideas that are yours, that belong to you and your community, that's kind of branded or imbued with the values of your community and what you are all about as a school, right? That's why Helen Gordon has their own feel and brand. They have their own culture. They have their own way of belief, right, about what their school is and what schooling is. That's why Reggio Emilia has that, right? That's why, all these schools, right? So these schools that are young, right? So Discovery Zone is relatively young, right? Compare that to Helen Gordon that's been around for 60 years. The Reggio schools have been around for 70 years, right? Like they have their own cultural identity, right? And so Discovery Zone now, you guys are starting this work. All this work that we're doing together is shifting and changing the identity of the school, of your school, right? And what happens then is that even if you leave, right? Even if there's turnover and don't leave, right? But even if there's turnover and people leave, the work that they've done and the conversations that they've had and the work that they leave behind becomes a part of the identity of the school, right? So what I'm provoking, right? What I'm provoking you all to do is to have these kinds of conversations, right? Have conversations about, what is it that the children are learning here, or what are they thinking about here? Oh, what about this idea of using clay in this way, right? How would that help us, right? How would that change the experience? Asking these kinds of open-ended questions where people are talking with each other and asking each other these kinds of questions and responding to each other, that develops your cultural identity. You don't want to be just another Reggio-inspired school, right? This is us starting on that path, right? There's a million, I don't know, there are thousands of these kinds of schools, right? And what eventually happens when they start on this path is they start to form and develop their own identity that's uniquely theirs. Okay. All right. So, yes, they do offer opportunities for richer and deeper learning, and that's gonna, where this is really gonna change Discovery Zone in the long term is in the future when you start, like, let's say in the future you do kind of have a new budget to buy new things, to get new things. I'm sure you're going to ask some different questions than you asked before when you bought those other materials and those other things, right? That it starts to slowly shift piece by piece, little by little. Okay. Okay. Am I too far off base here? It seems okay. Got me. Okay. Yes. All right. So let me respond to this. So when it comes to provocations at tables, right? The reason I have to kind of be transparent with you. The reason why I set up that video that way, that video on provocations, which seems to be one of the more powerful videos that I've shared with you all. The reason why I shared it that way and showed you videos where there's some sort of piece of paper asking a question and then there's some materials around it on a table is because that felt like a good scaffold for me to present to you, right? Provocations can be a very complex and complex subject with a lot of different creative opportunities. And a table activity is something that generally a lot of early childhood classrooms do, and it's something that I've seen before at Discovery Zone. You guys were already doing table activities, and that's why I presented provocations in that way. Now, the thing is you mentioned it here that it was powerful when I told you that everything is a provocation to young children, right? What I, sorry, what I'm trying to say here is that just because I shared that video about the tables, that's not the only way to go about doing this, right? What we're trying to do is just get to a point where we are being very, very intentional about what these things are, right? And how we're presenting them, and consider how much of a material would we provide and which material would be better, right? Um, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. And then, okay, no, you are not off base at all, actually, right? So when you're setting up a table activity or a provocation or an inquiry or whatever, right? When you're setting up anything, the this idea of deepening children's learning, right? Asking different questions, having children um, become just more aware about the questions that they're asking and how they might possibly ask that question. That is the purpose of all of this. It's not just the provocations. It's all of this. It's about that, right? Okay, the teacher's role. Okay, I had so much to say about this. So yes, the teacher's role is to observe. The teacher's role is to document. The teacher's role is to ask questions. The teacher's role is to essentially follow the child's lead. I would adjust this just a little bit, right? It's not about following their lead per se, as much as it is paying attention to their lead, right? When they take the lead, paying attention to it. There's kind of a give and take here. I've talked about this before. It's not about, okay, teacher directed versus child directed, right? Usually, this is kind of traditional behaviorist, what we've always done. Teacher directed. Teacher makes the decisions, teacher chooses, teacher decides what the outcomes are, milestones, everything. Child directed. Child makes all the decisions, they guide everything, right? I have never seen fully child directed ever be successful. I'll just say that, right? It's not about fully child directed and it's not about fully teacher directed. It's not black and white like that. It's more about negotiated learning, right? Negotiated learning. Child and teacher together making decisions about what it is that they're working on and the questions that everyone is asking. Okay, so I've already talked about this. You should feel kind of that disequilibrium. Hopefully, it's not frustration where you're like raging and destroying things, but it should feel like that there's a little bit of discomfort because that's growth. And so when you're okay, so you're talking to me about. So you're trying all these new ideas, and you're seeing that there hasn't been a particularly strong interest in any topic. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say. The act of observing young children is something that is probably the most difficult thing, in my opinion, in my experience, in my opinion, is the most difficult thing about working with young children. In Reggio, they have a term that they call the pedagogy of listening, which I fully don't even understand. It confuses the heck out of me, right? When they're talking about the pedagogy of listening, right? They view that listening and observing as a teacher is an act of pedagogy. That is teaching. That when I'm listening and observing and paying attention, that is teaching. I think that's what it means because I don't I haven't fully wrapped my head around that concept, right? Let me offer you something else. When it comes to observing young children, right, the Reggio people have written several books, not several, but a few different books about observation, about documentation, about their pedagogy, right? And this book, The Diary of Laura, which is can be cheap on Amazon or Powell's if you get it used or something like that, right? Can be cheap. This book is shows the what the Reggio people did around kind of creating diaries for their young children. It talks about why they created it and what they were trying to do, and then it has kind of essays towards the end of other educators around the world kind of explaining what they've learned or seen from the use of the diary and this story. Now, the most famous story in this book is the story of Laura, or Laura, right, in Italian, and the watch, right? And this is their most famous story in this book. Okay, so this is how the story goes, right? I'm just paraphrasing here. So the teacher shows a magazine, and there's a watch, right? And Laura sees on the teacher's wrist the watch, and the teacher feels inclined to have Laura listen to the watch. As the child kind of goes through the magazine, she puts her ear to the magazine to hear if the magazine also ticks, right? And so that was something that happened between the teacher and the child. Now you may look at that and say, "Oh my, what's the importance of that? Why is that learning, right?" This is a story to them and to me and to other people who have written about this, right? This is a story about learning, right? So this child had this experience, right, of listening to this, and then said to within her brain has come to some new understanding of what that is, and so she tests her theory out. She tests her theory out, and her assumptions and her theory confuses her, right? She's in that space of disequilibrium. She's trying to figure it out. She's trying to make sense and meaning of the world. And this story to them, I think the reason why it's so famous is because it's such a simple, beautiful, and elegant story of what learning looks like when we redefine learning, right? So that's their process of documentation. Why am I showing this to you? This diary that they set up. This was something that was done. Oh my gosh, decades ago. It's one of the earlier Reggio books that came out. Right. That was something that they did way back when. Right. That was something that they did way back when, and they've developed and they've enhanced their understanding of observing children and the pedagogy of listening and doing documentation. And now they create documentation that kind of looks like this. So they have these stories and the pictures, and they have work samples, and it's obviously they understand. First of all, technology has helped them to be able to create documents like this, right? And again, it gets to them sharing stories of what they understand about what learning is and the experiences that they're providing, right? Oh my gosh, look at that thing. I already showed you this one. This is a study on chairs, right? So their understanding of documentation and observation evolves, right? It changes over time. And so that's what that's kind of what I want to kind of offer to you is this idea that, uh, where we are now in observing children and doing documentation is exactly that. It's where we are right now. That doesn't mean that's where we're going to be tomorrow or the day after that or the week after that or the year after that. It's something that you only get better at by practicing, right? So when it comes to taking observations and doing observations and observing children, I strongly recommend that you just put a little bit of intention behind it. I've already kind of offered you the idea of carrying around a sketchbook or a journal or something of that nature where you can collect your own drawings and your thoughts about what's going on and how well ends there, but where things are going and what you're thinking about and what you want to do, right? So this is this is us in our journey. This is where we are right now. And I think that the other comment I wanted to make about these what you kind of called out about the teacher's role, I think we'd generally agree that the teacher does a lot more than that. It's like I said before, it's a highly multidisciplinary field and profession, and we do a lot more than that. But these things that you called out are the things that I have called out that probably ask you to do it differently than you've ever done before, or probably I've been asking you to do it with more intention than you've ever done before. So, um, the only way that all of this is going to get better is through practice. Okay, so let me give you some more pragmatic advice here. First of all, I love this. I love that. That makes me so happy. And being unsure about how to take these observations and turn them into deeper learning, that's something that, it's a topic that we probably should spend some more time on. I haven't, I've mentioned these things. I have not gone in depth into them. I mean, let's see if I have any books here on it. No, they're, yeah. So here's one. Kid Watching. That's a great book. Working in the Reggio Way. That's another great book about this. Um, Doing the project approach, engaging children's minds. These are things that we have not really talked about in depth about what documentation is and what documentation can be. For instance, I haven't necessarily talked to you in depth about how generally in American schools the way we think about documentation is assessment. And the only time we ever formally write or do anything with assessment is when we do documentation is when we do assessment. And that's very different than what I've offered you, I think, last week when I was talking about formative observations, right? Formative assessments, where it's not about where is the child right now and what have they learned. It's more about what am I going to do as a teacher and what can I learn from the children in order to make me, help me to make better decisions. This is something that, you just have to practice. And what I would suggest for you, I need to kind of see you in action and kind of see it all happen. But what I would suggest to you is to do exactly what I just shared, is to carry around some kind of sketchbook, right? Or for me, I would carry around a digital device, a phone or a camera or something like that that had voice recording, it had video, it had pictures, it had everything I needed, right? And start taking these observations and then spend a little, if you have the time, and I know it's hard to carve out this kind of time, but if you have the time, just start writing about it. Like just freely, just start. What do you think is happening? What do you think is not happening? Right? What do you think the child's inner question is? What have they verbalized about their questions? Right? What theories are they building on? These are all questions that you can grapple with within one observation. Within a single observation, you could spend that amount of time asking that question. And let me tell you, when the Reggio people do something like this, they ask those questions for hours and hours and hours. There's so many pictures of the Reggio teachers like sitting around with their notebooks and their papers and their pencils and just talking. And there's always like a little bit of wine in the background. It's Italy, right? So, that's part of the culture too that that they have, that I'm kind of provoking you all to do, is to have those types of conversations, and you'll get better. You'll get better. I'll tell you this: when it came to observing children and paying attention to them, for me, I would say the first few years I sucked at it. I was really bad. I was wrong way more than I was right, and I would offer weird provocations that never worked. But that was part. I would still document that and tell those stories, right? That's me giving value to what it was in that experience and what the children did. I mean, they had a rich experience within that. Um, it wasn't like they were just bored out of their minds, right? But it was me growing as well. I was a protagonist in that story. The Reggio people talk about that a lot. Who are the protagonists in the story? Who are the main characters, right? And so, okay, that's okay. So I've also shared. Okay, let's talk about these videos that I've shared. So in this video here on that CNN news report, it really kind of gives you a window into what the Reggio people are doing, what their schools and classrooms look like, and what it means to be an American teacher learning about their approach. Really, really great video. If you watch it over and over and over again, like I have, there's always more and more that you can kind of get out of it. This video here does exactly what you were asking, which was to see the Reggio teachers in practice, like a day of their kind of work. Now, this is a toddler classroom, but you still see the same principles and ideas, and it gives you some insight about how the Reggio people think. It's very fascinating. Love this video. This video here is going to help you. It's a more pragmatic video for the questions that you were asking around, how do I turn an observation into something bigger, which is exactly the questions that these two teachers were grappling with in this video. It's a very powerful video on this project that these two American teachers made around their project, Tall Buildings, and that will give you some ideas. But I know I keep mentioning this is because I don't want to set you up to feel like you too need to be like some sort of overnight success, that you watch these videos and then all of a sudden you get it, right? No, no, like it's something that's gonna develop over time. And the only way to get better at any of this is to do it and to be okay with failing and messing up and being a beginner, having that beginner's mindset, right? And asking yourself questions and supporting each other, right? As a staff, as a group, and asking me for support. Now, this was a very kind of broad conversation around your post, and I know that what you were looking for were like pragmatic tips and how to's and that sort of thing. And I've always said this, I don't do well with how to's because really what I know is going to be more valuable for you is how to think about this so that you can do it for yourself. Because if I told you what to do, right, if I gave you a step by step process about what you need to be doing, then you would just use that process until it didn't work. And when it didn't work, you'd come back to me and ask for a new process or a new step by step or a new how to. And it's not about me. I'm just one teacher. Some of you might take this, run with it, and just, be like super teacher, right? You already are. I'm sorry, that was a terrible comment to make. But what I'm saying is what you do with what I say should be yours and your own, and it should belong to you. And I truly believe that. I truly believe that that's what this experience should be like, which is frustrating and hard and takes longer, but it's more sustainable and it's more powerful. All right. I hope this helps.